It was late October 1988, the kind of damp, bone-cold night that felt heavier than it should. The air in northern Oregon hung low with fog, swallowing the narrow roads that twisted through the outskirts of town. Corporal Thomas Rourke, 37 years old, was on his way home after a long swing shift at the county sheriff's office. He'd been with the department for over a decade. Everyone knew him, not just as a good cop, but as the kind of man who still stopped to help change a stranger's tire or bring coffee to the night clerk at the gas station. He had that quiet, old-fashioned steadiness about him. Married, one kid, no enemies anyone could name. That night, he signed off just after midnight. The log showed his route home, a 15-minute drive along County Road 12, a stretch bordered on one side by dense timberland known as Trevino Forest. He'd driven that road hundreds of times before. But by sunrise, his patrol car was still sitting there, engine idling in the mist. When a passing logging truck spotted the cruiser at 6:40 a.m., the driver thought it might have been a traffic stop. But something about it didn't look right. The driver's door was wide open. The headlights cut through a curtain of fog, and the police radio hissed with white noise. The seatbelt hung loose over the doorframe, swinging slightly in the wind. Deputies arrived minutes later. The scene was strangely frozen, as if Rourke had stepped out just moments ago and would come walking back any second. His jacket was still in the front seat. His clipboard, his thermos, and even a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, all untouched. The key was still in the ignition, the fuel gauge hovering above half. About 20 feet from the car, a faint metallic glint caught the light. It was Rourke's flashlight, lying in a ditch, its beam flickering weakly into the mud. There were no skid marks, no broken glass, no signs of a struggle. Only tire impressions from the patrol car itself, and the faint outline of boot tracks that led toward the tree line. They stopped abruptly, just before the ground turned to dense pine needles. At first, everyone assumed an ambush. Rourke had been investigating a rash of burglaries along the county line, a series of break-ins believed to be tied to men he'd arrested years before. Some of those men had been recently released. Others had disappeared from parole supervision entirely. The department's first thought was retaliation. But even that theory didn't quite fit. There was no blood, no evidence of a vehicle nearby, and no witnesses. By noon, the sheriff's office had declared a full-scale search. Helicopters from the state police circled overhead. Volunteers and fellow officers formed grid lines, combing through the woods shoulder to shoulder. They called out his name for hours. Tom Rourke. Their voices swallowed by the trees. The dogs picked up a scent briefly, leading handlers about half a mile into the forest before stopping at the edge of a shallow creek. From there, nothing. The trail simply died. It wasn't unusual for people to get lost in Trevino Forest. The place stretched for miles, deep canyons, marshy ground, old logging paths that didn't appear on maps anymore. Locals said the forest had moods. It could be quiet one moment, and then out of nowhere, you'd swear you heard voices. Some blamed it on wind through the canopies. Others said it was something older, something that didn't like being disturbed. By the second day, the Rourke family arrived at the command post, his wife Elaine, pale and shaking, holding their 8-year-old son's hand. Reporters had already gathered near the roadblock, and the story spread quickly. A respected officer gone without a trace, his car still running. The department tried to maintain professionalism, but inside the command trailer, morale was fracturing. Officers who'd worked with Rourke couldn't make sense of it. They retraced every move from his final shift. He'd handled 2 minor calls, a noise complaint, and a trespassing report near a mill site. His last radio transmission was calm, routine. He mentioned clearing from the scene and heading home. Dispatch logged it at 12:14 a.m. After that, silence. Investigators examined the patrol car in forensic detail. No fingerprints other than his own. No signs of forced entry. The seat was adjusted exactly to his height. The fuel line and wiring were intact, ruling out mechanical failure. Even the radio frequencies showed no sudden interference or distress call. It was as though he'd simply stepped out into the fog and vanished. Within 48 hours, the case began shifting from an officer-down search to something stranger, a disappearance without logic. That's when the rumors started. Residents from nearby logging camps told deputies they'd seen lights deep in the woods that night, faint and rhythmic, like lanterns moving between the trees. One man claimed he heard shouting, followed by silence. None of it was corroborated. Elaine Rourke refused to leave the search site. She spent nights sleeping in her car, wrapped in his jacket, waiting for news. Detectives tried to protect her from false hope, but privately, they admitted something felt off. If this had been an ambush, they should have found evidence, a shell casing, a weapon, drag marks, anything. Instead, it was like the forest itself had swallowed him. By the end of the week, the operation had grown desperate. They brought in divers to sweep the nearby Trevino Creek, dragging the cold, black water for hours. Nothing surfaced. They searched the old fire roads, checking every ravine, every culvert, every hunter's shack for miles. And still, nothing. Then came the whispers, not from townsfolk, but within the department itself. Some officers started wondering aloud whether Rourke had planned this. Maybe he was under pressure. Maybe he'd gone rogue. It wasn't the first time an officer had disappeared after financial trouble or burnout. But anyone who knew Rourke pushed back hard. He loved his family. He wasn't the type to walk away. Still, strange details surfaced. A few weeks before he vanished, he'd requested access to case files unrelated to his assignment. Old burglary reports tied to a logging contractor named Henson and Sons, whose operations bordered Trevino Forest. It didn't raise flags at the time. But in hindsight, it suggested something was weighing on him. The sheriff held a press conference 9 days into the search. Standing at the roadside, surrounded by cameras and gray skies, he said what everyone feared. At this point, we cannot confirm foul play, nor can we rule it out. Behind him, officers stood in silence, their faces drawn. By the 12th day, search crews scaled back. The cost was mounting, and the evidence was non-existent. What remained was a patrol car, a flashlight in a ditch, and a family without answers. Elaine returned home that night and found the house just as he'd left it, his uniform pressed for the next shift, his shaving kit open on the sink. She sat on the edge of their bed and waited until dawn, still half expecting the sound of his boots in the hallway. But the sound never came. As the first winter storms rolled through, the case was quietly reclassified from missing officer to cold file. The official statement listed his disappearance as unexplained. The unofficial one was harder to accept. That sometimes the forest keeps its secrets. But not everyone was ready to let go. In the months that followed, there were sporadic reports. A hunter who swore he heard a voice calling for help in the timberline, a hiker who found a torn scrap of blue fabric deep in the brush. Each lead was investigated. Each one led nowhere. By spring, the posters along County Road 12 had faded from rain. The department moved on to new cases. But for Elaine, every time she drove past that stretch of road, she slowed down, looking toward the wall of trees, half expecting to see a flashlight flicker back. And somewhere in the heart of Trevino Forest, past the moss and the silence, something still waited, untouched for years, half buried beneath the mud. The story of Corporal Thomas Rourke was only just beginning. Within hours of finding the patrol car, the investigation expanded into the forest itself, a stretch of land that, even in daylight, felt ancient and uneasy. Trevino Forest had always carried a strange reputation among locals. It was too quiet. The air was heavy with the scent of rot and pine, the ground soft enough to swallow your boots if you stood too long. When the county search teams first entered that maze of moss-draped trees, they believed they were retracing Thomas Rourke's final steps. What they didn't realize was that the forest was about to erase them just as efficiently as it had erased him. The first thing searchers noticed was how sound vanished beneath the canopy. Voices dropped off after only a few yards. Radios crackled with static. Even the dogs seemed unsettled, whining without reason. It was a terrain that played tricks, ravines disguised as shadows, streams that led nowhere, game trails looping endlessly back to where they'd begun. Within hours, a deputy spotted something near a patch of disturbed soil, muddy impressions, faint but clearly human. They matched the tread of police-issued boots. Investigators photographed them, marked the coordinates, and followed the faint trail deeper into the brush. The prints continued for about 100 yards before stopping abruptly beneath a ridge. Beyond that, the ground was untouched. It was as if whoever left those tracks had walked straight into the earth. Forensics logged the discovery, but couldn't draw conclusions. The soil composition made impressions unreliable. The rain that had started overnight was quickly turning everything to sludge. Still, for that brief moment, everyone on the scene believed they were closing in. The sheriff ordered more units to canvass the perimeter while volunteers fanned out with handheld radios, marking each possible clue with orange tape. The next morning, a team from Portland's forensic unit arrived to conduct a grid search. They worked methodically, using cadaver dogs, metal detectors, and drones. Deep in a thicket of overgrown blackberry vines, one technician found a strip of dark blue fabric snagged on a bramble. The material was consistent with a police uniform, the stitching pattern identical to the shirts issued by the department. But it was torn unevenly, suggesting it had caught on something as the wearer moved through the brush. DNA testing would later confirm it matched Rourke's. That single piece of cloth reignited hope. Maybe he was still out there somewhere, injured but alive. For 3 days, officers pushed deeper into the forest, moving camp as they went, but the terrain fought back. Rain fell nonstop. Rivers rose. Paths turned into trenches of mud. Helicopters overhead could barely see through the low ceiling of fog. And every time the team regrouped, they realized they'd gained nothing. The boot prints were gone. The torn fabric was all they had. Meanwhile, at home, Elaine Rourke was unraveling. She refused to believe her husband had simply vanished. She began replaying their last conversation over and over in her head. He'd been distracted that evening, quiet, almost distant, but she remembered one line vividly. As he put on his uniform, he said, "Something big is about to break. I just need to see it through." She assumed he was talking about work, maybe the burglary cases he'd been following. But now, in hindsight, it sounded different, like he was stepping into something personal. Detectives started looking into that statement. They interviewed Rourke's colleagues, his sources, even a few former suspects. One name came up repeatedly: the Henson family, owners of a timber operation that bordered Trevino Forest. The Hensons had been under quiet investigation for years, accused of illegal logging on federal land and moving stolen machinery through shell companies. They had political connections, enough to make most officers tread lightly. But Rourke hadn't been the kind to look away. When detectives checked his locker, they found a small notebook tucked behind a stack of reports. Inside were hand-drawn maps of forest roads, coordinates, and a list of initials, HSDHRM, alongside short phrases like night runs and creek bridge meet. It was obvious he'd been working something off the books, something he hadn't told the department about. The sheriff ordered a new focus area, the western quadrant of Trevino Forest, where several old logging roads intersected. Teams moved in, expecting to find equipment or makeshift camps. Instead, they found remnants of a ranger outpost, a cabin that hadn't been used in nearly a decade. Inside, dust coated everything. A cracked lantern sat on the floor, next to boot scuffs in the dirt. At first, they thought the tracks were recent, but analysis showed they'd been there for weeks, maybe months. It was another dead end. Back in town, Elaine began receiving strange phone calls. Always around 12:15 a.m., the same time her husband had radioed in his last transmission. The line would ring, she'd answer, and there'd be nothing but static. Sometimes she thought she heard breathing. The department traced the calls but found no origin. The sheriff told her it was likely a malfunction or a cruel prank. But she didn't believe that. She started keeping a notebook of every call, logging the time and duration. Every night she sat by the phone, waiting for it to ring again. By the end of week 2, the search effort began losing momentum. The state police had poured more than 100 man-hours into the operation. Volunteers were exhausted, their boots torn, their morale breaking. Even the most experienced trackers admitted defeat. Rain continued to wash away everything they found, every boot print, every trace. When the 3rd week arrived, the forest grew still. Helicopter sweeps turned up nothing. The county brought in sonar equipment to scan underground voids and shallow graves, but the results were inconclusive. Without a body, there was no closure, no proof of life or death, just a lingering question that clawed at everyone who'd worked the case. What could make a man vanish in such a short distance from his car? Officers began talking off the record. Some believed Rourke stumbled into a sinkhole or fell into a river and was carried downstream. Others whispered about darker possibilities, that he'd uncovered something he wasn't supposed to, that someone had been waiting in the forest that night. By the end of that month, the sheriff's department quietly scaled back. The command post was dismantled. The search area markers were removed. The official statement released to the public said, "No further leads at this time. Investigation ongoing." But inside the department, everyone knew what that really meant. Corporal Thomas Rourke was gone. The case file stayed open, but no one expected a breakthrough. Elaine refused to hold a memorial service. She kept his badge on the kitchen table, polished clean every week, just as he'd left it. At night, when the rain beat against the roof, she swore she could still hear his radio echoing faintly through the static of those silent phone calls. And deep in Trevino Forest, the evidence they'd missed, the truth they couldn't see through the rain, waited quietly beneath the moss untouched, as if the forest itself was keeping a secret it refused to give back. By 1994, the story of Constable Thomas Rourke had become little more than a whisper in Trevino County. His name, once mentioned with respect, now carried the uneasy tone of a ghost story. People avoided saying it in full sentences. Some claimed to have seen him wandering the woods late at night. Others said he'd skipped town to escape debts or disgrace. But no one really knew. His wife, Claire, couldn't take it anymore. She packed up what was left of their lives, her son's drawings, Rourke's old service revolver, and the folded flag the department had given her, and left town quietly, without telling anyone where she was headed. For her, the forest wasn't a place anymore. It was a wound that never closed. The department moved on, too. Faces changed, patrol cars were repainted, and new officers took the oath. But the file marked Rourke T. disappearance stayed in the cabinet, gathering dust. It wasn't until nearly 18 years after that stormy night that someone pulled it out again. Detective Michael Lang was fresh from the city, a transfer with a reputation for noticing things others didn't. He'd been assigned to a case review program, and when he reached Rourke's file, something about it caught his attention. It wasn't just the disappearance. It was how unfinished it all felt. Pages were missing. Evidence logs were half completed. There were notes scribbled in pencil that didn't match the official handwriting. Lang started reading the transcripts from the original search. The last radio transmission had always been recorded as static. Nothing useful, nothing clear. But tucked between two unrelated reports, he found a typewritten summary dated 2 days after Rourke vanished. It mentioned an unverified radio entry logged by dispatch just minutes before the silence. The time matched the gap in the original radio log. It had been crossed out in blue ink, but faintly beneath it, someone had written, "Possible contact." That was the first thread. Lang went deeper, pulling archived tapes from the department's old communication center. Most of them were degraded, hissing, warped by humidity, but one stood out. It wasn't cataloged in the disappearance folder. It was labeled only with a date, May 12, 1986, the day Rourke vanished. When Lang played it, the first voice was unmistakably Rourke's, steady, professional, but tense. He was reporting his position near the northern perimeter of Trevino Forest. The second voice came in, Sergeant Dale Henson. The two exchanged short, clipped messages about checking an abandoned logging road. And then there was a break, just a low breath over the mic, followed by Rourke saying, "I think I see someone." The line cut off there. No follow-up. No response. Lang replayed it again and again. The dispatch record from that night didn't mention this call at all. There was no copy of it in the evidence inventory, no note in Henson's report, nothing. Someone had deliberately kept it out. He began requesting interviews with anyone still around from those days, retired officers, search volunteers, dispatchers. Most were reluctant. The years had buried more than memories. They buried loyalties, too. A retired dispatcher named Eileen Parker finally agreed to talk. Her hands trembled as she recalled the night Rourke went missing. She remembered the static on the line, the muffled breath, and how she'd written the log entry by hand before her supervisor told her to leave it blank until further notice. When she asked why, he said it was above her pay grade. Lang asked who the supervisor was. She hesitated before saying, "Sergeant Henson." By then, Henson was living 2 towns over, long since retired. His home sat on a wooded property, quiet, isolated, the kind of place where no one asked questions. When Lang showed up to request an interview, Henson refused to open the door. Through the screen, his voice was sharp but weary. "I told everything I knew back then. I'm not talking about Rourke anymore." He closed the door before Lang could hand him a card. Inside the department, whispers started to resurface. Officers who'd known Rourke remembered how he'd been investigating something on his own before he vanished, something involving illegal timber operations that tied back to a local contracting family. Henson had been his direct supervisor at the time, and Rourke had reportedly told a colleague he thought someone inside was warning the loggers before raids. That same week, he disappeared. Lang wrote all of this into his new report, but he could feel the quiet resistance. Files went missing from archives overnight. A few senior officers advised him to let the old cases rest, but the unease only grew stronger. He wasn't chasing a ghost story anymore. He was chasing something that had been buried deliberately. Weeks turned into months. Lang followed every lead he could find. He retraced Rourke's last route through Trevino Forest, even finding the old logging road from the dispatch tape. The forest hadn't changed much, still overgrown, still heavy with silence. He could imagine the headlights cutting through mist, the radio crackling, the moment when everything stopped. He took soil samples from near the site, compared them to old forensics, but nothing new came up. It was as if the woods had swallowed every trace. Then, in the summer of 1998, something unexpected surfaced, not from police work, but from an accident. A logging crew clearing land near the northern boundary of Trevino Forest was uprooting a massive cedar when one of the workers noticed something metallic tangled in the roots. It was small, almost buried in rust and clay. When he wiped it off, the engraving became visible, T. Rourke. The crew foreman called the sheriff's office immediately. Within hours, investigators were on scene. The nameplate was confirmed to be a standard issue from the 1980s, Rourke's exact badge style. For the first time in over a decade, there was something tangible. Something real. Lang drove out to the site himself. The air smelled of sap and rain. The cedar's roots spread wide, twisting through the earth like veins. The badge had been lodged deep, almost as if the tree had grown around it. He stood there for a long time, not saying a word, just staring at the small corroded metal that had somehow survived the years, the storms, and the silence. Back at headquarters, the evidence room buzzed with quiet speculation. Some thought it was coincidence, a lost badge dropped during the search years ago. Others believed it was a message, something left behind by whoever wanted the case buried. Lang couldn't shake the feeling that the forest hadn't just hidden Rourke. It had been protecting the truth. That night, he wrote his report by hand, the way detectives used to. The last line read, "Recovered nameplate confirms subject made contact within northern Trevino perimeter. Possible struggle or concealment site still unverified." He closed the file but didn't lock it away. Because for the first time in 12 years, Rourke's story wasn't finished. It was breathing again, quietly, somewhere out there among the trees. It was early spring 2000. A season when Trevino Forest usually began to thaw from its long, heavy winter, when fog lifted off the moss and the sound of water returned to the gullies. For most, it was just another quiet patch of green in northern Oregon. But for locals, the forest still carried a story they didn't talk about much anymore. The story of Constable Thomas Rourke. 12 years had passed since he vanished without a trace. Long enough that the town had learned to live around the mystery. Long enough that even the search parties had been reduced to family legends and faded clippings in the sheriff's archives. That quiet broke on a Sunday afternoon in March. A lone hiker, a local contractor named Eli Vance, was cutting through a neglected section of Trevino's northern edge, an area left untouched for decades since logging was banned there. The forest floor was a mess of downed branches and new growth. A storm had rolled through 2 nights earlier, washing out the trail and leaving the earth soft and uneven. As Eli stepped over a fallen cedar, his boots sank into thick mud and hit something solid underneath. He crouched, brushed away the wet earth, and saw the outline of another boot. At first, he thought it belonged to an animal carcass or maybe a hunter who'd lost gear. But when he cleared more of the muck, the pair of boots appeared, half buried, caked in mud, cracked and stiff with age. The laces were still tied. Eli took a few photos with his disposable camera, then hiked out and reported it to the county sheriff's office. Within hours, deputies arrived and taped off the area. They lifted the boots carefully from the ground, cleaning away decades of soil. Despite the damage, the leather still showed faint serial embossing along the heel. The numbers matched the department's 1980s issued footwear inventory. Size 11, standard patrol issue. The same size Constable Rourke had worn. The find sent a quiet ripple through Trevino County. For most residents, the name Rourke brought back a mix of fascination and discomfort. He was the officer who vanished on duty, the man no one could agree on. Some said he'd been killed. Others believed he'd run. Now, for the first time in years, there was something physical to hold on to. Forensic teams combed the area. Just a few feet away from where the boots had rested, they uncovered a fragment of decayed leather, what looked like part of a holster, and a single rusted bullet casing nearby. The items were cataloged and sent to the state crime lab. Preliminary analysis suggested the boots had been exposed, then reburied several times by erosion and floods over the years. The level of decay, combined with soil compression, pointed to them being there for well over a decade, almost certainly dating back to the time of Rourke's disappearance. But what troubled investigators was what wasn't there. No bones, no fabric from his uniform, no sign of a struggle. Just the boots, perfectly aligned, as if someone had taken them off deliberately. The search expanded across a half-mile radius. Teams laid down grids, brought in cadaver dogs, and even dredged nearby creek beds. In one small clearing, beneath a mat of ferns and pine needles, they discovered something subtle but telling: a rusted coffee tin, its lid dented but intact, half filled with dark sludge that used to be grounds. A few feet from that, a circle of blackened soil, the remnants of an old fire pit. And beside it, tiny shreds of faded canvas, their fibers consistent with police field tarps used in the late 80s. It was as if someone had lived there, or at least stayed long enough to try. The find reignited every rumor that had ever surrounded Rourke's name. News vans arrived from Portland. Reporters staked out along the dirt roads leading into the forest, filming officers walking in and out of the trees. They spoke of new evidence in the Rourke case, speculating whether the missing officer had survived, hidden himself, or met a violent end somewhere nearby. Theories multiplied overnight. Inside the sheriff's office, the tone was different. Older deputies, those who'd served during Rourke's years, kept their heads down. The younger ones, who had grown up hearing the story, whispered about it like an urban legend come back to life. Investigators pored over the scene reports, trying to make sense of what the forest was revealing piece by piece. The working theories split into three. The first, Rourke had been injured and tried to survive on his own, camping deep within the woods until exhaustion or exposure claimed him. The second, he had staged his own disappearance, moving his gear to mislead search teams before vanishing for good. The third, the one no one wanted to put in writing, was that someone had moved the boots there later, long after he was gone. But each theory came with a problem. If Rourke had stayed alive out there, where was his body? If he'd run, why leave his boots? And if someone had staged the scene, what were they trying to say after 12 years of silence? A few weeks later, the crime lab confirmed what many had already suspected. The soil within the boots contained trace elements of pine resin and decayed plant matter consistent with long-term exposure to forest flood zones. They'd been there for years, almost certainly since the late 1980s. But the fibers from the canvas scraps told another story. They were scorched unevenly, suggesting they hadn't simply decayed. They'd been burned. The discovery forced detectives to reopen the case again. Evidence bags filled a new shelf. Search maps were pinned with fresh markings. One of the state investigators, reviewing the old file, noticed a strange detail buried in the 1988 reopening, when Rourke's corroded nameplate had been found in the roots of a cedar, just miles away from this site. The coordinates, when plotted, formed a line, both discoveries falling along a forgotten stretch of logging trail that had been decommissioned in 1985. That road led north, deeper into Trevino, toward what had once been an old ranger outpost. The sheriff ordered another sweep of the area, and for the next week, crews worked methodically through mud and brush, following the contours of the land. Every so often they'd stop, listening to the wind moving through the trees, the same woods that had held its silence for over a decade. When news broke that Rourke's son, Jacob, now in his 20s, was flying in from out of state, the tone around town changed. People who hadn't spoken his father's name in years gathered quietly near the sheriff's office, watching as he arrived, tall, quiet, carrying the look of someone who had grown up in the shadow of a story he never got to finish hearing. That afternoon, investigators allowed him to visit the site. They warned him it wasn't much to see, just a small clearing marked with tape and flagged soil samples, but he went anyway. Standing there, he asked to hold the boots. Deputies hesitated, then handed them over, wrapped in clear plastic. He stood in silence, turning them over slowly in his hands. The cracked leather, the mud still packed in the soles, the faint outline where the laces had rotted away. He didn't cry. He didn't say anything at all. After a few minutes, he simply nodded, gave them back, and walked away toward the tree line. Reporters tried to get a comment, but he didn't stop. That image, the son of the missing constable walking alone back into the same forest that took his father, aired on every local station that night. To the town, It was a haunting reminder that some stories refuse to stay buried. The forensic work would continue for months, testing fibers, soil, even the faint traces of metal oxidation on the bullet casing. But none of it could answer the one question everyone had avoided asking aloud. If the boots had been there since 1988, how had no one ever found them, especially when search teams had combed this exact area dozens of times? Some believed it was just chance, the forest shifting over time. Others whispered something darker, that the woods gave them back when it decided to. Either way, the discovery had changed everything. The forest that once held nothing but silence was speaking again. And this time, what it revealed would pull everyone, detectives, old colleagues, even Rourke's family, deeper into a truth they might never be ready to face. By early summer of 2000, the case had become something larger than a mystery. It was a shadow cast over an entire county. Every new discovery, every soil test or artifact that surfaced, seemed to breathe life back into something the town had tried for years to bury. After the boots were found, detectives from the State Bureau took over. They didn't just want to confirm what had happened to Corporal Thomas Rourke. They wanted to understand why everything about this case felt slightly wrong. Detective Marla Vance, a methodical, quietly obsessive investigator, was assigned to re-examine every name connected to Rourke's last year on the force. She started with the old case logs, handwritten reports from 1988, the kind that still smelled faintly of old ink and cigarette smoke. That's when she noticed something odd. Several of Rourke's final shifts had taken him to an area near the southern boundary of Trevino Forest, close to the Henson property, a stretch of land that, on paper, had been listed as inactive timber operations. The same Henson property belonging to Sergeant Dale Henson, Rourke's colleague and former friend. Henson's name had lingered in the background of this case for years. His abrupt retirement weeks after Rourke vanished had raised quiet suspicion at the time, but nothing substantial ever connected him. He'd moved away, bought a cabin 2 towns over, and faded into obscurity. When detectives pulled up his address in 2000, they were surprised to learn he'd returned recently, his health failing, his once heavy frame thinned by illness. Before contacting him, investigators secured a warrant to search the abandoned portion of his old property, a forgotten clearing that bordered the lower forest line. The place had been left to rot, collapsed sheds, overgrown grass, remnants of machinery swallowed by moss. But when ground-penetrating radar was brought in to survey the area, the readings showed something that made everyone stop, a rectangular section of disturbed soil near one of the old outbuildings. Over the next 2 days, a small excavation team worked carefully beneath the broken boards of the shed. The first thing they uncovered was a fragment of decayed canvas, wrapped tight around something solid. They unrolled it slowly, layer by layer, until the outline of a revolver appeared. The weapon was rusted but intact, its serial number still legible. Within hours, the lab confirmed what many already suspected. It was Corporal Thomas Rourke's service weapon. Forensic analysts found something even more unnerving. The revolver had been cleaned and re-oiled at least once, years after his disappearance. And on the handle, beneath a thin layer of corrosion, they lifted partial DNA belonging to none other than Sergeant Dale Henson. When the results came back, the reaction inside the department was chaos. Rourke's name had always been spoken with reverence, Henson's with quiet caution. Now the two were tied together in a way that forced everyone to confront a truth they'd been avoiding for 12 years, that Rourke's disappearance might not have been random at all. Detectives reached out to Henson, who was by then in hospice care at his home. He was gaunt, breathing through an oxygen tube, but when told what had been found, his expression didn't show surprise, just resignation. He agreed to talk. What followed wasn't a confession in the legal sense. It was more like an unburdening. Henson spoke slowly, pausing between breaths, his words rasping as if dragged up from somewhere long buried. He told him he and Rourke had been running a quiet off-duty inquiry into a timber smuggling operation that had grown out of control in the late 80s. Several local contractors had been stealing old-growth lumber from protected zones and selling it through backdoor channels. But as the months went on, the operation expanded into something darker. Guns moving through logging trucks, cash payments hidden in mill accounts, names that reached higher than anyone wanted to believe. According to Henson, Rourke had discovered that one of their own was involved, a deputy coordinating the shipments under the radar. He didn't name who. But on the night of his disappearance, Rourke had planned to meet one of the smugglers near the southern forest line to gather proof. Henson, worried, followed him out there. What happened next, Henson said, was chaos. There was shouting, flashlights in the dark, the sound of someone running. Then gunfire. He remembered Rourke collapsing, a flash of blood against his shoulder, maybe his chest, he wasn't sure. The smugglers panicked and fled into the trees. Henson, terrified, checked for a pulse but found none. Convinced Rourke was dead, and fearing the entire operation would be pinned on him, Henson and the two men dragged the body deeper into the forest, covering it with branches. They left the scene before sunrise, promising to return later to move the remains properly. But when they did, 3 days later, the body was gone. Only Rourke's flashlight, radio, and a torn piece of his uniform were still there. The men panicked, arguing over what to do next. Henson took Rourke's weapon, cleaned it, re-oiled it, and buried it beneath the shed on his property. He said he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. It felt like the only piece of truth he had left. When detectives asked him why he'd never come forward, Henson looked at them for a long time, his eyes wet but distant. He said no one would have believed him, that it would have ended his life, his career. And then he said something that chilled the room. "You don't understand. When we went back for him, it looked like something had dragged him away." He didn't elaborate, and his health was too weak to press further. Within a month, Henson passed away. His statement, recorded and signed, became part of the official case record. Back at the sheriff's office, the confession only deepened the mystery. On paper, it explained the weapon, the cover-up, even the silence within the department. But it didn't explain the one thing that still haunted investigators, the missing body. And the boots. If Rourke had been buried near the southern line, how had his boots ended up a mile north, near the old cedar grove, decades later? Theories split again. Some detectives believed the smugglers had returned, moved the remains, and scattered the evidence to confuse investigators. Others thought animals or erosion had displaced fragments over time. But the most unsettling possibility was that Rourke hadn't died that night, that he'd somehow regained consciousness, disoriented and bleeding, and tried to crawl his way out, his final trail lost to the forest. That thought lingered in every conversation, every late-night review of maps and reports. The coordinates of the weapon, the boots, and the earlier nameplate find all aligned in a narrow corridor stretching across the forest's spine, a section of land few had explored since the late 80s. When detectives returned to the Henson property one final time to recheck the excavation site, one of them noticed something faint beneath the soil near where the revolver had been buried, another patch of disturbed earth, smaller this time. They marked it for future analysis, but by then the weather had turned. Heavy rains set in, flooding the dig site and forcing them to postpone. That spot, an unremarkable patch of brown under a collapsing shed, would later become the center of a new search. Because what the ground was about to reveal, once the rain stopped, would finally show what had been hidden in Trevino Forest all along. And when they uncovered it, 12 years of silence would give way to something far more chilling than anyone expected. The news of Henson's confession spread through the precinct like a shockwave. Men and women who had once worn the same badge as Rourke sat in silence at their desks, processing what they'd just heard. Some refused to believe it outright. Others just stared at the floor, knowing deep down that something about the case had always felt wrong. For Detective Avery, who had taken over the investigation years after the disappearance, it felt like the first solid lead that might finally unravel the truth, or twist it beyond recognition. That night, as rain pattered softly against the station windows, Avery sat across from Henson in a dimly lit interview room. The old man looked frail, his face sunken, skin pale against the metal table. Tubes ran from beneath his hospital gown, feeding oxygen into his nose. His voice was weak, but his words carried the weight of something he had been holding on to for decades. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said quietly. Rourke didn't deserve that. He spoke of a night filled with shouting, of flashlights slicing through the forest, of figures moving between the trees carrying crates that shouldn't have been there. "He got hit," Henson whispered. It was dark, and then silence. When Avery asked who fired the shot, Henson didn't answer. He just looked down at his trembling hands. "We tried to move him," he said, "but we couldn't. So we hit him." The room felt heavier with every word. Henson admitted that he and 2 other men buried Rourke's body near a ravine south of the Henson property, marking the spot with a broken pine limb. They returned 3 days later to move him to a safer location, but the body was gone. "What do you mean, gone?" Avery asked. Henson's eyes filled with something between confusion and fear. "I mean, it wasn't there. His uniform, his flashlight, his badge, they were still in the dirt. But not him." He said it like a man who still didn't understand what he'd seen. like someone who had revisited that memory every night for 20 years. He described how they'd searched the area for hours, calling Rourke's name in a whisper, terrified someone else might hear. But there was nothing. No tracks, no drag marks, not even a hint of where he might have gone. They took the weapon, buried it, and made a silent pact never to speak of it again. When the confession ended, Henson was shaking. The machines beside him beeped softly. He looked up at Avery and said, "He's still out there. Somewhere. And I think he's angry." Avery didn't respond. He just closed his notebook and left the room, the sound of Henson's breathing machine following him down the hall. The next morning, the excavation site near the collapsed shed was sealed off once again. Forensic teams swept the area inch by inch. They mapped the disturbed soil, collected samples, and ran full-spectrum analysis on the canvas wrapping that had preserved the revolver. The results were strange. There were signs the gun had been cleaned and re-oiled multiple times in the years after Rourke disappeared. Someone had been maintaining it. Someone who wanted it to stay functional. Avery found himself driving to the forest that afternoon, tracing the southern line of Trevino Woods where the Henson property dissolved into endless green. The air was heavy, damp with fog, and the smell of pine was overwhelming. He stopped at the old fence line where the radar scans had first detected the anomaly. The collapsed shed stood a few yards ahead, sagging under years of rot. Beyond it, the forest stretched in all directions, quiet, endless, and watchful. For years, locals had whispered about that part of Trevino Forest. Some claimed to hear voices near the old ranger cabins. Others said they saw lights moving through the trees long after midnight. Most dismissed it as superstition, but Avery couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself held on to secrets longer than people could bear to. He found himself kneeling at the site where the revolver had been buried. The ground was damp, covered in moss and old needles. The soil had the faint smell of iron and decay. He imagined Henson there 20 years ago, digging in the dark, his hands shaking as he covered the weapon. Then he pictured him returning days later, expecting to find a body, and seeing only the impression of it in the dirt. The story didn't add up. If Rourke had died there, the forest should have given them something: bones, traces of clothing, evidence of decomposition. But there was nothing. The soil had been disturbed, yes, but not in the way consistent with long-term burial. And then there was the issue of the boots. They had been found nearly a mile from the alleged burial site, positioned neatly side by side near the creek bed, as if someone had placed them there deliberately. The contradiction gnawed at Avery. Was Henson's confession half-true? Or was someone manipulating the evidence to steer the investigation in a certain direction? That night, he reviewed old logs, dispatch records, ranger patrol notes, early witness statements. A pattern began to emerge. Unregistered trucks entering the forest late at night, surveillance photos showing the same 3 license plates over and over, all linked to logging contracts that no longer existed. The names connected back to Henson's own patrol routes. Avery couldn't prove it yet, but the implication was chilling. Henson's smuggling operation may have been much larger than anyone realized. And if Rourke had discovered it, if he had confronted the men behind it, then his death might have been less accidental and more necessary. Still, something about Henson's story rang with sincerity. The way he described the fear. The way he said the body was gone before they could move it. That kind of detail didn't feel rehearsed. It felt haunted. 2 days later, Henson died quietly in his sleep. He left behind no written statement, no names, no coordinates. Just a single note to his daughter that said, "I tried to do right by him in the end." At the station, Avery read the note over and over. Then he called the forensic lab for one last analysis, the soil on the revolver's canvas wrap. The results stunned him. Traces of lichen and sediment not native to the Henson property, but to a specific section of Trevino Forest nearly 2 miles deeper in, near an old ranger trail known as Mile Marker 9. Avery went there alone. The forest felt wrong that day, silent in a way that pressed against the skin. He walked until the trail gave way to undergrowth and thick mud, until the air smelled of stagnant water and iron. And then, in the distance, he saw something, half buried in the dirt near a tree stump. It was a length of rope, old and frayed, tied around the base of the tree like a marker. Beneath it, the ground looked sunken. He didn't dig. He just stood there, staring at the spot, feeling the weight of everything that had come before. Because if Henson's confession was true, if Rourke had really been buried once and moved, then the forest hadn't just hidden a man. It had swallowed a truth no one was meant to find. And somewhere beneath that canopy of moss and silence, something was still waiting to be uncovered. In the spring of 2001, 25 years after Officer Thomas Rourke vanished into Trevino Forest, a new forensic task force arrived in the county with technology that hadn't existed back then. They brought updated aerial imaging, satellite mapping, and a renewed determination to re-examine the places that older investigators had been forced to abandon. Among them was Detective Avery, now grayer and slower but still unable to let go of a case that had haunted the department for decades. For months, the forest had been quiet. The trail markers from the original search were long gone, swallowed by moss and time. But the data from the new imaging revealed something strange, a faint depression near a dry creek bed, just beyond where Rourke's boots had been found all those years ago. It was subtle, barely visible from the ground, but from above, it appeared as a shallow oval, unnatural, deliberate. Avery stared at the image for a long time before whispering, almost to himself, "That's not wind or water." The team moved in the next morning. The air was damp, the forest floor soft from weeks of rain. Investigators used hand trowels, brushes, and small spades, working in silence, the sound of shovels muffled by pine needles. It didn't take long. Just a few feet down, the soil changed color from deep brown to a pale, clay-like layer. Within it, fragments began to appear, a belt buckle, a rusted badge, and beneath them, the unmistakable shape of a human ribcage, curled inward as if frozen mid-breath. The scene was hushed. No one spoke for several minutes. Even the forest seemed to still itself, as if aware that something sacred had been uncovered. The coroner moved carefully, documenting each piece, while Avery stood off to the side, motionless. When the badge was lifted from the soil, the name was nearly illegible, the letters corroded but still faintly visible: Rourke. Dental records confirmed it the following week. After 25 years of rumors, theories, and whispered arguments, the department finally had an answer. Thomas Rourke had been found. But the relief didn't last long. The autopsy revealed a single gunshot wound to the side, consistent with Henson's dying confession. But there was something else, traces of soil embedded deep within Rourke's fingertips, and signs of movement in the clay around the remains. He hadn't died where he'd been shot. He crawled. The wound wouldn't have killed him immediately, but it would have been enough to make walking impossible. The coroner believed he had survived for at least 2 to 3 days after the injury. Near the remains, investigators found a small lean-to made of branches and bark, half collapsed but still standing. Inside it were remnants of fabric, possibly torn from his own uniform, and a rusted lighter engraved with the initials TR. It was clear that Rourke had built himself a temporary shelter, an act of instinct, of sheer will. He tried to stay alive. The boots, once believed to have been deliberately placed near the creek, now made tragic sense. He had likely taken them off to dry while tending his wound or fetching water from the stream. Over time, the forest did what it always does. It buried what it couldn't return. When Avery reviewed the scene photos, he couldn't stop thinking about the image of those boots standing side by side in the mud, untouched for decades. For years, they had been treated as a riddle, a deliberate message. But now they were something else, proof of a man's quiet fight to survive. Back at the precinct, the case file that had grown thick with conflicting statements and dead-end reports was finally closed. But there was no sense of victory in there. The discovery had brought answers, yes, but not the kind anyone wanted. It had stripped the mystery of its intrigue and left behind something far heavier: human error, fear, and silence. The official report described Rourke's death as accidental, the tragic result of a failed confrontation and a series of panicked decisions. But off the record, everyone knew the truth was more complicated. Rourke had been left behind, not just by circumstance, but by people who should have gone back for him. The guilt had festered in silence for decades, spreading like rot through the department. Henson had carried it until it consumed him. And now, even in death, it lingered. When word of the discovery reached Rourke's family, his wife was already gone. She had died 2 years earlier after a long illness, never knowing what became of him. Friends said she kept his badge photo on her nightstand until the end, the edges worn soft from years of touching it. Their son, Michael, now in his 30s, had become a deputy himself. The same uniform, the same badge. When he was told his father's remains had been found, he asked only one question: was he alone? Avery didn't know how to answer. He had stood in that clearing, seen the small shelter, the faint drag marks leading toward it. He had felt something there, an echo maybe. The sense that Rourke hadn't gone quietly, that his final hours had been filled not with despair, but determination. A man trying to do what he'd always done: survive, protect, endure. Months later, when the remains were finally laid to rest, Michael stood beside the grave in full uniform. The other deputies lined up behind him in silence, their badges catching the faint light of a gray afternoon. No words were spoken. The sound of rain against the casket filled the silence instead, steady and rhythmic, like the distant heartbeat of the forest that had held him for so long. After that, Michael began visiting the site every year on the anniversary of his father's last radio call. He would park near the old Ranger Road, hike the half-mile into the timberline, and stand by the creek bed where the ground still bore the faint outline of the excavation. Sometimes he'd leave his own badge there for a moment before picking it back up, a quiet exchange between two generations bound by the same uniform and the same unanswered questions. The official files now sit in the archives of the county sheriff's department, yellowed, sealed, and marked closed. But for those who worked the case, closure never really came. It was replaced instead by reflection on how a chain of fear and silence could bury the truth deeper than any grave, how the forest had kept its secret not out of malice, but out of indifference. In the end, Rourke wasn't taken by a conspiracy or a calculated act of murder. He was lost to something far more ordinary and far more tragic: panic, guilt, and the quiet decay of human judgment. Even now, when storms roll over Trevino Forest and the wind moves through the pines, locals say you can still hear the faint crackle of an old police radio echoing through the trees. A call sign repeating into the static, unanswered. A name spoken into the rain, one that no one has answered in 25 years. And somewhere out there, beneath the moss and the timberline, the forest keeps listening.